Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Auto-Biography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 20. Not a word from covert. Was not the silence ominous? But anyway, Martha was out of his power, and we had that important possession which is 9 points of the law. Ephraim heard from Hoboken in the course of the day. All went smoothly there. Nathaniel came in on his way home to say that the office, with the exception of himself and his dog, was quite deserted, he also having received from his master no word or command that day. I did not altogether like this stillness, for I feared covert's craft, and that there might be something behind of which I was not yet aware. My reflections convinced me, however, that there was no better course for our side than to keep quiet and let the enemy make his move for himself. The hour was yet early when I retired to my room that night and placed my lamp on the table. I had been pretty seriously impressed with the occurrences of the past few days, and with the reflections in the graveyard of Old Trinity. I took from the drawer, where I had deposited it, the manuscript written by the unfortunate father of the Quakeress, for I felt that I was in a fitting temper to read it. When I had removed the envelope and opened it, I found the manuscript written in a hasty and often scrawling manner, evidently under the influence of excitement. It was upon the strong, stiff paper used many years since, and still remained in perfect preservation. That it interested me completely, and that I felt a deep sympathy for the unfortunate gentleman who had committed it to paper, is certain. Time and his punishment obliterated anything that might otherwise have been resentment in my feelings toward him, and his story came to me more like something I might read in a book. The tone of the narrative is morbid, but under the circumstances that must of course be expected. Narrative of Martha's Father. Whoever you are, into whose hands this dismal story may fall, oh, let me hope that my daughter may read it and drop a tear for her parent. Whoever you are, whether daughter, friend, or stranger, I begin my narrative, written in prison, to while away the heavy hours and leave the chance of one little legacy of sympathy for myself by a command. Look around you on the beautiful earth, the free air, sky, fields, and streets, the people swarming in all directions. All this is common, you say. It is not worth a thought. I once supposed thus, like you, but I suppose so no longer. Now all these things seem to me the most beautiful objects in the world. To be free, to walk where you will, to look on freedom, to be free from care, too, by which I mean not to have your soul pressed down by the weight of horrible odium or disgrace, not to have a dreadful punishment hanging over you. Oh, that is happiness. Happiness! Alas, what absurdities pass among men under the name. Happiness! I am in prison, with death perhaps waiting for me, and I write some of my thoughts on happiness. Is there indeed no specific for the enjoyment of life? Come we here on earth but to toil and sorrow, to eat, drink, and beget children, to sicken and die? In that world, the heart of man, glisten no sun rays and bloom no blossoms, as in the outer world? And love, and ambition, and intellect, and wealth, fountains whence in youth we expect the future years to draw so much of this happiness, as their fruition comes, does not disappointment also come? I would that the devil in the Garden of Eden had been made to tell the young man what it was that led to felicity, that in these modern days, the pursuits in which men engage with so much ardor, the men all around us, do not reach it, is evidence. Wealth cannot purchase it. The newspapers every month contain accounts of individuals, assuredly prosperous in all their pecuniary affairs, and some of them young and healthy, who in the very midst of what the poor think perfect bliss have committed self-murder. The successful seeker after rank and place is not happy, not from that success at least. The most learned scholars are often the most melancholy men in the world. Beauty grieves and pines as much as the brain which wears a homely face. Elegant dress frequently covers a sick soul, and the furniture of a handsome carriage may be but the trappings of misery. Then among the busier and more laboring kinds of people, the same general absence of happiness prevails. It seems reasonable that he whose existence is one uninterrupted struggle to keep off starvation by slavery and hard work at that, should see but few bright days. But the man whose labors are effectual fares little better. The mechanic, the plowman, the literary drudge are alike debarred from any delicious experience of that sweet morsel we so much prize, but never obtain. I am speaking now not of the goodly gratifications of sense or everyday taste, which are common enough, but of the attainment at any time to that condition when a man can say to himself, I feel perfect bliss, I have no desire ungratified. Am I not philosophic here in my grated walls? Do you not see how keen my sight has become? And truly it is a consolation in this sort to think what a miserable world it is. But I would not be miserable if I had one great weight off my soul, and were at liberty again. Now, when I am nigh leaving life, my eyes are just opened to its beauty. Oh, what a cheap and common beauty! To be free, and not to be a criminal. For I have now also removed the greatest bar that once stood between me and happiness. That was a fiery temper. I have lost that now. I feel that if I should live 100 years, they would be 100 years without anger or revenge. How wild, how disconnected are my thoughts! How I talk of 100 years! Shall I see yet 100 days? A fiery temper grew up in me from my birth. My boyhood was fierce and uncontrolled. My home was not worthy the name. I had no home. Although parents cared enough for me to spend money liberally, and give me an almost unlimited indulgence that way, yet they did not furnish me what is most wanted from parents: good example, good counsel, and a true home roof. I was boarded, almost from the beginning, away in the country. For I had such a stormy temper, and my mother was nervous, and the servants would not stand it. And the father, he meddled himself with no such things, and did not even want to be spoke to about them. Was he not at all the expense? Could he not fairly count that enough? Besides, I was to inherit his property. That must satisfy me. It were too much to expect that he should give up his time for my education and the shaping of my character. Even the death of my mother, which occurred when I was a half-grown boy, made no difference in his treatment. Such are what the world calls good parents, for they do not beat their children nor starve them. They leave them estates too, and what does a child want more than money? When I grew up to be a young man, I was rude, boisterous, and ungovernable. Already I had fallen into many scrapes from my violent temper, but they were none of them hard enough to teach me the great lesson I needed. My temper was made, indeed, rather more unbearable from them, for I emerged victorious after all. One gleam of sunshine came across my life, and, for a time, subdued me into gentler condition. Love tamed me from my roughness. She was herself a being of peace and calmness, she whom I loved, and her influence brought into my temperament something of the same soothing qualities. She was of Quaker family, and perhaps it was that the very tameness to which she had been accustomed gave my free and independent manner the charm of freshness to her taste. For my affection was returned, truly and faithfully. She did not chance to see the worst phases of my character. Her very presence was soothing and pacifying, for never did I dissemble. I acted always as I felt, and had the occasion provoked, not even the knowledge of what an ungracious look it would possess in her eyes could have kept down my rebellious temper. My father had an attack of illness at this time which, in the course of a few weeks, was pronounced hopeless. I did not mourn. For what reason had I? He called me to him before he died, and, at the 11th hour, gave me some good advice. Some words. Doubtless they were very valuable, those words, but they were nothing but words. After the tree has grown up, with the bend in its trunk and the shape of its branches formed, would it do to stand before it and preach a sermon of good advice? Would it change that bend or the gnarled branches? But a few months passed away after my father's death, when I found myself married and comfortably settled. Those were my happiest days. These tears that roll down my cheeks while I write attest it. They are not bitter tears. The time of which they are the remembrance is the only gleam of pure light in the course of my past career of cloudy, checkered fortune. And, sweet as it was, that long-continued honeymoon, the saving freshness it brings to me now, is perhaps the most beautiful part of it. It illumines this prison cell. It bestows a charmed atmosphere even in these sad and somber walls. A child, too, blessed our marriage, a fair daughter. May she be blessed in her life with something of that blessing which she brought to us. May she live, and, when she looks back on these dismal days, and the tears drop for her ill-fated father, Then perhaps the story of my life will have its office in her mind. I commenced this document with some gloomy thoughts on happiness. But gloomy as they are, and fitted for my present situation, I am almost tempted to blot them out. The memory of the 20 months that followed my marriage is a full denial of him who would say there is no happiness on earth. Surely my good genius was in the ascendant all that time. Oh, how soon was it to be followed by a thunderstroke! There was a man of my own age, but poor and hardy, whom I had known while we were boys together, when I was boarding in the country. He had in many things been my friend, but, even when youngsters, we frequently quarreled, for he would never submit to my domineering temper. He belonged to what are termed the common classes, and, as I had wealth, perhaps it was that which separated us afterward. For I met him often in the city to which he had himself come, and was earning his living in a poor way. Illiterate, hard-working, and married to an ordinary and rather shiftless woman, he was not much worse off when his wife died and left him a widower with a little infant son. My evil genius it was that put this man in my way. His hard life had formed him to a temper as morose as mine was fiery. He occupied part of a mean dwelling close in the neighborhood of my own costly residence, and various causes conspired to bring us into contact. I had not thought of it before, but it seemed to me now, notwithstanding the little services of friendship which he had performed for me, that there had always been some seeds of antipathy between us. He made sarcastic remarks about my appearance and manners. He thought I was, from vulgar pride, unwilling to acknowledge the former intimacy with him. He was mistaken in the cause, although right in his conclusion. I gave out a contract to make some additions and repairs on my premises, and this man was engaged by the contractor, in a laboring capacity, among his workmen. I was too proud to utter a word about it, but his appearance was greatly annoying to me. He took a bitter advantage, too, of the position he had relative to mine, and often was I conscious of his sneers and jibes as I passed along, followed by the suppressed laughter of the workmen. This was all a trifle, it may seem, and so indeed it was. But that man made, to me, the Jew sitting in the king's gate, a living mockery to my pride. One time, when his remarks were coldly insolent to my face, I swore to him that if he repeated his unprovoked outrages, I would dash him to the earth. He laughed tauntingly, but at that time replied not a word. I was conscious, at the while, that I cut a poor figure before the men who surrounded us, and that added to my vexation. A few days later, oh, dismal hour, I went through the newly building part with the boss, giving directions and receiving explanations of the proposed work. We had got through talking, and I was about to leave the place, when I heard one of this man's sarcasms upon me, upon my pride, and even about some peculiarities of my person. The boss had left, unfortunately, although the workmen were all around. I suppressed my anger, which was suddenly rising, and even turned to leave the place. I had to pass my enemy on the way. He enjoyed his triumph, and just as I was passing him, he coolly and deliberately spoke to me words of still deeper and more provoking influence than ever he had uttered before, and directly addressed them to me with the evident design of cutting me to the quick. My blood was already afire in my veins, and this maddened me. I hardly remember now with sufficient distinctness what passed. I think I had gone a couple of steps beyond where the man stood, but the fury was too much then. I turned, made one spring upon him, and in the rage of my anger wrenched from his hand the mallet he had been working with, and dealt him a blow directly on top of the head. My arm was unnaturally nerved by an insane ferocity. It was the stroke of death. He fell like a log, and I stood there a murderer. The ensuing few hours are like a hateful and confused dream to me. I was neither asleep nor awake. I felt a sort of numbness, and remember closing and shutting my eyes incessantly. I did not stir from the spot during the horror and the outcries, and hurry and dread of the immediate half-hour that followed the murder. I stood and looked on the poor fellow's body, and I thought, strangely enough, of us too when we were boys together, when we had often gone out fishing and swimming and gunning together. I thought of the services he had done me, and remembered what a brave boy he was, and how, in any trouble, he never deserted me then, but stood as staunch as steel. Even the little incidents of our country life came up before me, our friendship, the fences where we crossed, the orchards, the shores, the old leaky scow, the hickory poles that were used for fishing rods. Could it be that I, now, was the murderer of that boy? Even the thought of my own condition and of my wife and little daughter were crowded aside by such remembrances as these. They came slowly and turgidly floating through the current of my mind. A wild, despairing shriek, it rings in my ears now, roused me from my reverie. Oh, that terrible cry! It was the agony of a broken-hearted wife, of a soul crushed to powder by one stroke. She breathed my name, whispered it faintly and lovingly. Her ghastly face, with a frightful dampness upon it, turned toward me, and yearningly, in the weakness of her sinews, endeavored to reach up to my own sweating features. I lifted her, pressed one long, tight kiss upon her lips, and then resigned her inanimate form to those who bore her to the bed where she lay unconscious of life or sorrow for 20 hours. Then this pure-souled creature died as a flower might wilt of a chilly evening, silently and without complaint. I made no effort to escape, and I think I did not utter a word to the officers who guarded me to prison. An awful blank seemed to spread through the mental part of me. Cold as ice, without any action or object or warmth. It was not painful, at least not beyond a dull, deadened sense of something like fullness which oppressed my head. 1 hour! What a change it had made for me! I was not treated with any roughness, either by the crowd who gathered quickly to the spot or by the policemen. Some of the work-people gave a true statement of the insolence of the poor fellow I had slain, and how it was done in the sudden fury of the moment. They made the case as favorable to me as they could, and the appearance and overwhelmed sorrow of my poor wife completed the work of compassionate feeling toward me. Tears fell down many a weather-beaten cheek, and happily many a silent prayer was offered up for the wretched young man whose days were darkened with even a drearier fate than had befallen the poor victim there. And so I was in prison, a murderer. For my wife's death I felt no deep regret. To die was less grief than to live, I knew, in her case. Ah, was it not so in my own? The law, which is often cruel in minor accusations, is seldom so in great ones. I have been treated fairly and honorably here in my prison. Whatever indulgence could properly be given has not been denied me. There is a noble pity that frequently actuates jailers and officers of the law toward the wretched ones who come under their charge on their path to heavy punishment, a pity beautiful and honorable to their characters, and showing well in them. This compassion I experienced throughout, and it made me think better of my kind. After the first deadening, numbing night passed, the next morning, when the day dawned upon me here where I am now writing, I was a changed man. I felt composed enough, and indeed was without any of that anxious dread which might be supposed natural to one in my situation. At the same time, I was fully conscious of that situation. It was all present to me, and I comprehended every point of it: the crime, its legal punishment, the poor victim, my family, the lamentable violence of my former temper, the scene and incidents of the murder, the best points in my behalf. All were clearly arrayed before my thought. My former temper, I say, for I looked back now upon that as pertaining to a separate existence. I knew that, under any conceivable circumstances, it was mine no longer. The serpent had cast his slough. A legal agent whom I had formerly employed I picked out from several whose names I turned over in my mind, and sent for him. He was an honorable man, I felt sure, from his conduct when I employed him. Much to my sorrow, he was absent on a voyage of considerable distance. An answer to this effect has been brought me by a lawyer who, some years ago, had studied, he tells me, in the office of the absent attorney. Would it not be a good thought to engage this man for some of my small commissions at least? I questioned myself. His countenance is impassive, but he is a Quaker, and that fact recommends him to me. I have commissioned the man, whose name is Covert, to see to the decent burial of my poor victim, and have given him written authority and command of funds for that and a few other purposes. Many of my hours are occupied with the arrangement of my worldly affairs, for there has come to me a notion, amounting to a certainty, that I am dying. Friends to whom I have mentioned this fear endeavor to chase it away by saying that it is the result of my brooding thoughts, and that such vagaries often come into the minds of people under a great dread. I do not answer them, but I feel none the less the certainty of my death, nor is it painful to me. Here a blank, the next part of the manuscript being on another page. My will has been duly drawn up with minuteness. I have left the bulk of my fortune to my daughter, and a goodly portion of it, properly secured, to the child of my victim. Covert comes to me every day. He strongly advises me to make preparations for my trial, to engage the best legal talent, and so forth. He almost sneers at me when I answer that nothing of the sort is needed. He is a doubtful creature, this neither old nor young lawyer. I hardly know what to make of him. Upon the whole, however, I have concluded to trust him. He is now thoroughly advised of my intentions and affairs. I am particularly induced to make him my friend, for his wife, much older than himself, who is gentle and good, if there be any such qualities on earth, has shown the tenderest affection for my little child, whom she has consented to take charge of. She has no children, and treats my poor helpless one with all a mother's affection. The day approaches. I have made all my preparations, and I feel now calmer than at any time since I have dwelt in this prison. Should I think of anything more, I will add it. If not, let whoever reads this dark story know that I experience, while I write, more composure and rest than any day I recall during the years of my ordinary life, with the exception of my marriage time. I do not doubt that I am dying. My little daughter, may heaven protect her unprotected childhood. May God pity me, and may I continue to feel this soothing calm to the last. Here was a long blank, and the paragraph that follows was written evidently by another hand at another time. The prayer uttered in the last lines by my dear and unfortunate friend was not in vain. He retained his equanimity, and his forebodings were strangely verified. The day set down for his trial found him dead. That very day he was committed to the grave. He charged me with the narrative he had written, and intended for his daughter, should she live, as he had every confidence she would, and grow to womanhood. The remaining part of the paper, which filled several pages in the same hand as the last paragraph, consisted of some references, legal data, and religious advice, all of which would not be of interest. That was Chapter 20 of Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett.